Talking today about Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator by Roald Dahl. Apologies for everything showing up in mirror image on this camera. Hopefully the picture should still be clear, even though it will be reversed image. If you've been following this channel, I've been rereading the classics, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I had not read since elementary school, and next to Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, which I also have not read since elementary school. The impetus for coming back to these childhood classics is that my wife, who's Vietnamese and learning English as a second language, has picked these books up for the first time, and I've taken the opportunity to reread them to keep up with her reading and to revisit my childhood. Now, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, I had only remembered vaguely from childhood. I remembered they had gone up into space. I remembered there was some sort of alien that attacked them. And I remembered that alien... Oh, by the way, spoilers. I'm going to spoil absolutely everything about this book. I remember that the alien had gotten burned up upon re-entry back into Earth. And I think that's pretty much all I had remembered. I was talking... It's funny, you don't realize how much you've forgotten until you talk about a book with somebody, is my experience. So when my wife was reading this for the first time and she was telling me about all the funny parts in it, I was like, don't remember that. Don't remember that. Eventually I had to say, look, I'm sorry. I remember they burned up an alien when they were re-entering Earth's atmosphere. That's all I remember from childhood. And I remember enjoying it. I remember our first grade teacher, I think it was first grade teacher, read both of these books to us. And I remember enjoying them equally as much. But it turns out that's one reason why my memory is flawed, because it turns out that this book is not nearly as good as its predecessor. It's not nearly as entertaining. I don't know what your childhood memories of this book are. Perhaps, like me, you remember very little of it. But if you were to go back to this book, I think you would find it was not nearly as good. It's not terrible. I think Roald Dahl was, even when he was pretty bad, he was still pretty readable. Yeah, even on a bad day for him. One of his bad days is still like another author's good days. But it's not nearly as good. And it's especially a letdown after coming off Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which was just such a fun book to reread. I had forgotten how good this book was. And it could be that this is just a lightning in a bottle type situation where there was just no way to recapture the magic of this book with the sequel. Maybe that's what went wrong. I don't know. As I was reading this, a lot of the same elements are in here, a lot of the same wackiness and silliness, a lot of the same poems and puns are in here, as in the previous book. So as I was reading this, I was constantly asking myself, why am I not enjoying this as much? And sometimes it's really hard to put your finger on it. I mean, this was really good. This was not quite as good, but why? How do you put your finger on it? I'm going to spitball some stuff here, throw out some ideas of maybe why this didn't work as good, but ultimately, I'm a little bit... I had a definite emotional reaction, or I don't know if emotional is the right word, but in terms of my level of engagement, this one definitely hooked me in. This one not so much. But the trick is to try and disentangle maybe why this was not as engaging. Okay. One of the few things I do also remember as a kid is that Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator picks up right where Charlie and the Chocolate Factory left off. So yeah, I guess I have two memories of this book as a kid. I do remember they were quite interconnected. So the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie's family is all getting on the Great Glass Elevator. The Great Glass Elevator had been used with Willy Wonka and going around the chocolate factory, but it can also fly through the air. And then they all get in there, and then they're flying off in the Great Glass Elevator. And then this book picks up immediately where that one left off, with everyone in the Great Glass Elevator. This picture is a little bit misleading, actually, the cover one, because it's got Wonka, Charlie, and Grandpa Joe, but actually the whole family is in the elevator. Wonka, Charlie, and Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and Charlie are in the elevator at the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory briefly, but then they go and pick up the whole family. Okay, anyways. Because the beginning of this book and the ending of this book were so interconnected, I was a little bit surprised to check the publication dates and go on Wikipedia and discover that this book came out a full 8 years after this one. This one was 1964. This one was 1972. So I don't think they were originally planned together. I guess Roald Dahl must have ended off Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with them all getting on the Great Glass Elevator, but not. I think he probably didn't have much of an idea about where he was going after that. They go up into outer space. They're not intending to go up into outer space. Willy Wonka wants to get really far up in the sky so that he can come down really fast and make a hole in the factory. Now, he's already made one hole in the factory when he was bursting out of it the first time. So everyone says, well, why you already have one hole. Why do you need to burst down and make a second hole? Why can't you go back in the first hole? And he said, well, because 2 holes are better. And that doesn't make any sense. And that's supposed to be the humor of the story, is it doesn't make any sense. And that kind of stuff not making any sense, and you're supposed to wink at it as if the whole joke is that nothing makes any sense, is really true all the way out throughout this book. And that was true maybe to a small extent of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There were little things about the factory that didn't make any sense. And the kids would ask Willy Wonka about that. And then Willy Wonka would say, oh, you really mustn't mumble. I can't hear a word you're saying. And that would be the joke, was that he would ignore any logical questions the kids would ask him. So that element was there just a tiny bit here, but I think that kind of humor works well in very small doses. If you blow it up too much and really just nothing makes sense and the whole thing is ridiculous, then that humor loses its punch, which I think is what happens here. So anyways, they're going up and up and up, and the plan is to go down, but then at the last moment, Grandma Josephine panics and grabs Willy Wonka and shakes him. So Willy Wonka is not able to hit the stop button at exactly the moment he's supposed to hit the stop button. So then the elevator goes into outer space, and they're all stuck in outer space and without any gravity. And Willy Wonka makes it sound like a big deal, like, too late, cried Mr. Wonka. Oh my goodness me, we're cooked. Now look what you've done. And they ask him, did we go too far? Charlie asked. Too far, cried Mr. Wonka. Of course we went too far. You know where we've gone, my friends. We've gone into orbit. So it seems like, oh no, they're doomed. They're in orbit. There's no weight here, so they're floating around the bed. How can they ever get back to Earth? But then later, it turns out that Willy Wonka actually has propulsion on this elevator, and they can go back into Earth anytime they want. So I don't know what that is all about. But there's also a space hotel, which is just opening for the first time. And as luck would have it, there are three astronauts who, where's the picture of the three astronauts? Three astronauts who are carrying the workers to the space hotel, which is just opening now for the first time. And they see the glass elevator also heading towards the space hotel, and they radio back to the president. And the president and his cabinet think that there's some sort of sabotage or terrorist attempt to bomb the space hotel. And there's a big panic. Now, the president, this book came out in 1972, so I thought, okay, maybe the president's going to be a Nixon-esque character. Or, art is typically 5 years or so behind reality. Maybe the president would be a Johnson-esque character. But it's not really any satire of any recognizable political figure, at least if it was, it went over my head. It's just a very ridiculous president, typical Roald Dahl ridiculousness. Now, if you look at this pictures of this president, I don't know what fictional president maybe does this remind you of. To me, these pictures brought to mind the president in Doctor Strangelove. Doesn't it look a little bit? I mean, this is the president here, bald head, glasses. He's on the phone, calling up the other world leaders. And there is definitely a Strangelove-esque element to this. It's not completely that way. The president here is a lot more infantile than the president in Doctor Strangelove. And the president in Doctor Strangelove had a lot more... it's different, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But maybe the just general absurdity is similar. So I wonder if these pictures are intentionally riffing off the Doctor Strangelove movie. Although I've got to be a little bit careful making that assertion, because it was illustrated here by Quentin Blake, this edition. And if you look this up on Wikipedia, Quentin Blake illustrated the third edition of this book. He was apparently Roald Dahl's favorite illustrator, but he did not get selected by the publishers to illustrate the first or second editions of this book. He just came out with the third edition of this book, whenever the third edition came out. Let's see, does it say here? Yeah, I don't know. Reissued with new illustrations, 1995. Is that right? Yeah, illustration copyright Quentin Blake, 1995. Sorry, I'm just realizing for the first time how much later these Quentin Blake illustrations are. 1995, well, that was well after Roald Dahl originally wrote this book. Was Roald Dahl even still alive in 1995? It's on Wikipedia somewhere, isn't it? But he's got chief of the army who wants to blow it up, is constantly asking to blow things up. It seems like rather Strangelove-esque. And he's also calling the Russian premier, Soviet premier, 1972, and he's calling the president of China. The parts where he calls the president of China have not aged well. There are jokes about the names. First of all, everyone in China is named Wing or Wong, so it takes a few wrong calls before he finally gets to the president. It is very difficult to phone people in China, Mr. President, said the Postmaster General. The country is so full of Wings and Wongs, every time you wing, you get the Wong number. And then the assistant premier is Chuan Dat. and the president is how you been. And then there's jokes with the Chinese pronunciation and sentences. Greetings, Honorable Mr. President. Here is Assistant Premier Chuandat speaking. How can I do for you? Um, so, yeah, I think it goes without saying that that those jokes could not be written today. I'm somewhat mildly surprised it's still in print today. I imagine I would not be surprised if in the near future the editions of this which were printed would just edit out those parts about phoning up the Chinese. That being said, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I understand that we are living in an age of sensitivity. I think it's relatively harmless. I mean, I've lived in Asia for a long time. I know that at least with Japanese and Koreans, at least the RL confusion is real. It's not just a stereotype. I don't have as much experience in China. Um, the Chinese dialogue here, like he outside mending a puncture on his bicycle instead of he is outside. Well, yeah, that's a fairly common grammar mistake to omit the is for people in Asia learning English as a second language. So it's yeah, the fact that they're speaking in somewhat broken English and confusing the R and the L's is that inherently racist? There's an element of truth to that stereotype. Maybe okay. I'm gonna get myself in trouble if I continue on in that vein. I think it's relatively harmless, but yeah, you definitely couldn't have written that today. And then the names, Chuandat, how you been. Although to be fair, they also make fun of the Soviet names as well with stupid puns about the Soviet names. So it's not only Asian people. Okay. Then they encounter aliens on the space hotel, and there's an element, the further you get into the story, the less things make sense. I mentioned that before earlier, but and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was certainly ridiculous in its own way, but things made sense in terms of the logic of the book, more or less. And things were set up and then they were paid off. In Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, things are never really set up and nothing really makes sense. For example, they encounter these nasty aliens in the lifts. Something nasty in the lifts. This is British English because it's Roald Dahl. This version I have, I'm in Vietnam right now, so I think maybe I've got the version that was printed in the UK. They actually do make a big deal right in the first chapter about how we're calling it an elevator now and not a lift because it's actually left the factory and now it's elevating us up into the air. That's on one of the early pages. I suspect this is one of those. I don't remember obviously these details from when this was read to me in first grade, but I suspect it's like the Harry Potter books. The American edition probably changes it to elevators. Although I wonder actually, because the thing about using lists to describe the elevators inside the space station is you don't have a confusion between the elevators in the space station and the great glass elevator which they're flying around the outer space with. I wonder what's the title, the U.S. title for Chapter 7? Would it be something nasty in the elevators? But then does that gets a little bit ambiguous. Okay. Anyways, In the lifts or in the elevators, there's these aliens who pop up. And at first they just stare at the aliens. But then after a kind of a slow process, the aliens slowly elongate their bodies and make them into letters. And then they spell out Scram. And then Willy Wonka panics. He's, Scram! Shouted Mr. Wonka. Get out, quick! And they just all run back to the elevator and take off. And then Willy Wonka explains, he explains that these are the Vernicious Canids, who are these horrible space monsters who eat up everything. And then Charlie says, but if they're so fierce and dangerous, Charlie says, why didn't they eat us up right away in the space hotel? Why did they waste time twisting their bodies into letters and writing Scram? Because Mr. Wonka has been talking about how these Canids just are vicious monsters who just love to eat everything. So why did they spend all that time writing Scram? And Mr. Wonka says, because they're show-offs, Mr. Wonka replied. They're tremendously proud of being able to write like that. But why say Scram when they wanted to catch us and eat us? It's the only word they know, Mr. Wonka said. Okay, so none of that makes sense. And again, the joke is that none of that makes sense. But yeah, that's just very typical of the book, where there's just nothing makes sense, and then you can almost hear Roald Dahl say, "Isn't this funny that nothing makes sense?" Or it's different than Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where there are clear expectations of the way the world is supposed to work, and the humor plays off maybe the subversion of those expectations. Here it's just nothing makes sense from beginning to end, and it's not just that it's kind of a silly world with silly creatures, it's that even within the logic of the world, nothing makes sense. And then again later, the Canids, when the astronauts land in this space hotel, the Canids just eat them right up without bothering to spell Scram, or eat some of the crew up. Then, yeah, there's a few different songs which are inserted here. Actually, I say songs because within the context of the story, somebody is supposed to be singing them. But of course, on the printed page, they're just poems. So Roald Dahl, I think, liked to write silly poems. I think he had a whole book of them out. Some of them I've used for my English classes when I'm teaching English as a second language. They can be great fun. And apparently he just really liked to make these poems because they're all through both of these books. Now, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, he had a fairly good narrative device for how to integrate these poems, which is the Oompa Loompas. They just had to sing about everything. You couldn't stop the Oompa Loompa from singing. So something would happen, and then the Oompa Loompas would make a song about it. And that was part of the joke of the book, is that, it was just this queer habit, and, Willy Wonka would apologize to his guests and say, I'm sorry, they're going to have to make a song about this now. The same types of songs are inserted here, but now there are no Oompa Loompas. Now they're up in space. So now Willy Wonka is making up the song. And it just doesn't work as well for Willy Wonka to just make the song out of nowhere. And he's making up a song about the Canid who bruised his rear end trying to ram the glass elevator. But then very quickly it becomes apparent that this is a completely different story about the Canid going to a doctor, which is just purely all in Willy Wonka's imagination. It's like a separate story. I guess Roald Dahl had this poem he really wanted to use or something. So that all goes on for a while, and nothing really makes any sense about anything. And then they finally go back to Earth. at about page 100. They're going back to Earth. And then they're back in the chocolate factory, and they're being greeted by the Oompa Loompas. And then the space alien part of the book is done, and they're talking about these new pills that Wonka has, which will make somebody 20 years younger or 20 years older. Now, again, this is another thing that doesn't really make any sense, because at the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Wonka gave Charlie his chocolate factory because he was getting too old to run it. Now all of a sudden we find out that he's got these pills that can make you younger or older. And again, there is kind of a winking explanation, or they're kind of winking at the fact that it doesn't make sense. I think Wonka said that the pills are too precious to use on him, even though they end up completely wasting all the pills. They give the pills to the grandparents. It's clearly established that one pill takes off 20 years of your life, but they gulp down way too many pills anyways and turn into babies. And one of them turns into -2 years old, so then they have to go into minus land to get her out. And yeah, the thing about these pills that turn you younger or older, it's not a new idea. I think anyone familiar with cartoons or comics or children's stories is familiar with the concept of a pill that could make you younger or older. It's something fairly common that pops up in these types of children's stories. And if it had only been 10 pages or 20 pages of the book, I would have thought, okay, fine. But it just goes on and on and on for 80 pages. I mean, here Wonka is showing them the pills. They're arguing about the pills, so Wonka goes out to the waterfall because he doesn't want to hear them arguing. He comes back, and somehow they all took way too many pills, even though how they made that mistake when they all knew that one pill was 20 years. Who knows? Hopefully I'm not remembering that wrong. Then they're on the journey to Minus Land to find Grandma... Which grandma was it? Georgina or Josephine? Forget which one. So they're in Minus Land, and they're spraying her with the grow up again, and then she gets way too old. And then they have to do some calculations to get her back. It just goes on and on about these pills and this aging stuff for the last 80 pages of the book, which is just way too long to draw that plot thread out. And then the book ends with them being invited to the White House because they had saved the president. And so they're talking about what an exciting... Yeah, this is the president from earlier in the book. This is the invitation that they get from the president to go visit the White House. And so then they're all rushing off to visit the White House. And then that's where the story ends. And it ends just on that note, just as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory had ended... seeming to set up a sequel. This one seems to set up a sequel. According to Wikipedia, there was a planned sequel called Charlie in the White House, again picking up exactly where this one left off, which Roald Dahl only wrote one chapter of. And from Wikipedia, it's not clear why he only wrote one chapter of it. Was it like this big planned masterwork that he just died before he got a chance to finish? Or did he just write one chapter of it and he said, yeah, I'm not really into these Charlie stories anymore? I mean, clearly there's a decline in quality in this one, so maybe he just gave up on the last one. But that being said, this is a classic example of a story that doesn't need a sequel. It's a perfectly self-contained story about these 5 children who go on the tour of the chocolate factory. And it's just so wacky in a really fun way. And then once it ends, and it's difficult to take these same characters and send them on another adventure and still have the same sense of magic with it. I think this is like the Ghostbusters 2 phenomenon. You had one really great story, and You just can't expect two great stories out of it. So yeah, that's where I'm gonna finish off here.